This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is from our Protecting Animals series where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA has a new president and the new president is Dinesh Wadiwal. And they also have a new treasurer, Peter Chen. So all the names that you know, all the animal study scholars that you know, or many of them that you've heard on this podcast are involved in running ASA. It's a really good organisation and I strongly encourage you to think about becoming a member of ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This episode is also brought to you by the good people at Animal Publics. Have you checked out Sydney University Press yet? Animal Publics is a wonderful publishing opportunity for animal studies scholars. There is already quite an extensive collection of animal studies books on offer at Animal Publics, and they're always adding new titles. So if you're a reader or a writer and you're interested in animal issues, I encourage you very strongly to check out Animal Publics at Sydney University Press. Okay, well, let's get down to business. This is another episode that's being recorded online during the time of coronavirus. So it's a real shame that I'm not able to sit face to face and meet our guest this week, someone who I have known about and have been wanting to meet for a very long time. But this week we're lucky to be joined by Chris Delforth. Chris is Executive Director of Aussie Farms and is one of the people behind the popular documentary Dominion, which I'm sure many listeners have watched. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
So, Chris, can you start by telling us why you got involved in animal protection?
Well, I went vegetarian when I was 10 or 11. Just kind of had a sudden epiphany that animals probably didn't want to be eaten. It took another 9 years or so before I actually started looking into the philosophy behind it and any real kind of information. I didn't really want to know what was going on, and I definitely had no idea really about the kind of things that happen day to day in farms and slaughterhouses and animal agriculture in general. I kind of realized, I suppose, from an early age that I have quite a lot of privilege in my life and opportunities that a lot of people wouldn't have. And I thought it was a bit of a moral imperative to use those opportunities to try and make the world a better place. I started out from a human rights perspective, particularly looking at developing countries, issues of poverty. I visited Indonesia, I visited South Africa and Zambia, and kind of saw a completely different world to what I'd grown up with. And I came away from that wondering what could I possibly ever do that will make any kind of difference with this. And I suppose it was that kind of led me towards animals as something where I feel like I can actually make a difference. I can see my time is being spent effectively, and I feel like I can do some good. I started it was called the Youth Vegetarian Association at my university. I think that was probably my first go at animal activism, but even then I still didn't know much. I was still vegetarian at that point, eating eggs and drinking milk and milk products. I met a few vegans from the local animal liberation group, and they started opening up my eyes a little bit to the issues with eggs and dairy and just animal activism in general. And I started learning more and realizing how much I didn't know and it became kind of an addiction to find out as much as I could about this industry. I think anyone who finds out what's happening in these places thinks that they can go and tell everyone, and as long as everyone knows, everything will be fine. People will change. So I suppose I still kind of feel that way, but I spent a lot of time basically just trying to gather as much information and material and evidence as I could and putting it out there so that people could not go for as long as I did without knowing about this. And I wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to, if they want to see inside these places for themselves without ever actually having to leave their seat.
So, Chris, like I'm sure a lot of listeners, I've watched the documentary Dominion, and it seems to me that a lot of the footage in that documentary was possibly captured as a result of trespass. Mm-hmm. Do you feel comfortable talking about trespass? Is that a topic that you're comfortable talking about? To some extent, I suppose. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that's really interested me as an academic, and I'm someone who's trespassed quite a few times in order to have a look inside factory farms, what interests me is this inability to kind of really know animals, or their social invisibility just as we go about our normal life. What's your view? Do you think it's legitimate or even necessary for animal activists to trespass in order to see how animals live and die?
Well, the unfortunate reality is that these industries are never going to be transparent themselves. They're never going to show the public what they're actually paying for when they purchase meat, dairy, and egg products. The only way that people can see inside these facilities is as a result of trespass. That's not how it should be. There should be complete transparency, and I suppose that's what my work is about, is trying to force transparency on these industries. They rely on this secrecy. They rely on people just not having any idea, and you see, as soon as you start to break that down, it becomes very threatening for these industries. They'll fight back in any way that they can. It's clear that trespass and the gathering of footage through trespass is a major threat to that secrecy. And I wish it didn't have to be that way, but until the industry starts putting cameras inside facilities themselves and showing people not just the happy side of animals on rolling green hills under the sunshine, but they show them what life is actually like for animals in factory farms, in slaughterhouses, and even in the apparently higher welfare, free range, organic, those kinds of places that those words have effectively become meaningless buzzwords to try and make consumers feel better. But the reality is there's still horrific things going on across the board, regardless of what they like to call themselves. And so if they were more open about that, there'd be no need for activists to go and expose that themselves.
Indeed. Well, could you tell us a little bit about the making of Dominion? I think it's a beautifully shot documentary. It's also very, very informative, but also very confronting because, as we both know, the truth is, or the reality is very confronting. Can you tell us a little bit about the making of that movie and also how it's been received?
Yeah, so it was... Dominion was kind of the logical next step after my first film, Lucent, which focused on pig farming mainly. And Lucent had footage from around 50 different pig farms and slaughterhouses in Australia. And I wanted to give the same kind of treatment to other species, because certainly pigs are not the only animals who suffer in the animal agriculture industry. So it did require a lot of covert and overt footage. There was the use of covert hidden cameras, activists going in at night to film with handheld cameras, activists getting jobs and working undercover at some of these places, and a lot of drone footage as well to really show the scale of these facilities, which is something you don't often get when you see footage from inside at night, you don't get a sense of just how huge and numerous these places are. So there was well over 1,000 hours of footage that I had to go through to cut down to produce a 2-hour-long film. Probably several thousand hours of footage. I haven't actually added it up, but years and years of investigations went into that film, and the response has been. I mean, we always knew it would be a powerful film. We knew people would be affected, but we always thought it was only going to have relevance in Australia. It's actually done quite well internationally as well, because people recognise, thankfully, that this is not just an Australian thing. It is like this pretty much all over the Western world. This is the standard by which animals are raised, and there's often this argument people use when they see footage. They say, "Oh, it's not like that here." Here in Australia, we've got government, we've got the RSPCA who are looking after these animals and making sure there aren't any animal welfare breaches and cracking down when there are. So this film was largely about defeating that myth and showing people that even when things are done completely legally, it's still horrific.
Indeed, and for listeners, the documentary is available online at YouTube for free, and I highly recommend it. So it's been well received internationally as well as in Australia. So I guess the question then becomes, do you detect that things are changing as a result? Can you see some movement or some improvement as a result of movies such as Dominion, or is it kind of a very small step towards something that's, overwhelming to achieve?
I see change all the time. I think that there's a lot to be positive about. The animal rights movement is always growing. The availability of vegan and plant-based options has completely skyrocketed. It's now mainstream. I think a few years ago, I would have never thought that we'd have vegan burgers in Hungry Jack's and vegan cheese at Domino's and vegan sandwiches and pies at 7-Eleven. Wherever you go now, you can get vegan options. And I obviously can't attribute that directly to the film Dominion. I'd love to, but I think it's an important part of this overall shift in society towards embracing cruelty-free foods. It's building up that awareness. The more people who know about what's happening, the more people who are choosing not to support it financially. I think it's an important part of this huge cultural shift that we're seeing, but certainly not the only part.
So in addition to Dominion, you're also the executive director of Aussie Farms. For listeners who might not be familiar with Aussie Farms, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Aussie Farms?
So we are an animal rights organisation. We started in 2014. Largely to this point, we've been based online. We have a website, aussiefarms.org.au, which operates as a sort of repository of videos and photos from inside farms and slaughterhouses, along with an interactive map of where all those facilities are across Australia. And a lot of those facilities, if you click the icon, you'll be able to actually see inside it. So all of these things that we do through our website is about making it as easy as possible for any member of the public to do their own research and see inside these facilities for themselves without actually having to trespass for themselves. So we do campaigns relating to particular aspects of animal agriculture. Last year, for example, we did a couple of campaigns relating to the goat farming industry, goat dairies in particular, where we were able to expose the slaughter of the male goat kids who, like male calves in the cow milk dairy industry, are considered waste products because they'll never be able to produce milk. So at this particular farm, which is, I think, the largest one in the country, owned by quite a well-known goat farmer, the footage showed the male baby goats every day being shot in the back of the head with a bolt gun. We also were able to expose the use of a painful procedure called disbudding on female goats, where their little horn buds are basically burnt off with hot irons. And these are things that we've known for a long time has been happening, but now we're able to obtain this footage and put it out there and show definitively, yes, it's happening here, it's happening now, it's common practice, and it's indefensible. So largely we just draw attention to the standard practices that occur in the industry, because we think that even when things are done right, it's still quite horrific, and consumers have a right to see it for themselves.
Yeah, that's one of the depressing things about animal agriculture, I think, is no matter how many different procedures and restraints and operations without pain relief that are being performed on animals, there's always another thing to learn about, another kind of horror just waiting around the corner.
Absolutely.
So, Chris, I was going to say, I'm based in Australia, as are you, and the name of your organisation, Aussie Farms, is very Australian. I can't help but notice that Aussie Farms and your activities has attracted some attention from our political leaders. Can you tell us about the kind of less positive responses you've had to your work?
Yes, well, we've drawn the ire of people all the way up to the Prime Minister. Last year we were called green-collared criminals, we've been called terrorists, we've been called thugs, we've been called all sorts of colourful names by people who should at least be able to behave more professionally. But I suppose when we're up against such an enormous industry, it's to be expected that government is going to be on that industry's side, and they're going to do whatever they can to help that industry persevere in the face of an increasing and overwhelming amount of footage and other evidence showing how indefensible it is. So a lot of what the government has focused on has been about trying to stem this flow of evidence, trying to make it illegal to capture and publish and communicate photos and footage, to incite people to do that. So it all broadly falls under the term ag-gag laws, which is something that has been seen a lot in the United States, and there have been various attempts to bring it in here in Australia to varying degrees of success. So a lot of what has been implemented is about basically making a lot harsher laws like trespass. They're putting it under things like the Biosecurity Act, and they're fining people potentially millions of dollars for simply climbing a fence, walking into an open shed and filming and then publishing that footage. These are crimes that are already crimes. There are already laws in place to prevent people trespassing, but now there's a whole new suite of laws aimed to really discourage anyone from doing anything that would prohibit this secrecy that the industry depends on.
Indeed, yes. I mean, one of the things I tend to think of when I think of ag-gag is this notion that it kind of makes things double illegal. So, as you say, they're already illegal and now they're doubling down. Is it your sense that ag-gag laws are likely to, obstruct the animal rights movement in Australia, or do you think that there are just too many people who are too committed to trying to do something positive for animals?
I think there are too many people committed, regardless of what kind of fines or jail terms the government wants to impose. As long as these industries are secret and not transparent, there are going to be people who are going to to expose them, regardless of the potential risks for themselves. The way that the government should be going about preventing activists from going into these farms is encouraging and enforcing industry transparency themselves. That's what we've always been pushing for. But of course, that is not a great thing for the industry. So the government's never going to choose that path.
So we've not seen any positive moves in that way?
Nothing nothing real. I mean, we've seen little superficial improvements here and there, but a lot of it is designed at simply making consumers feel better about supporting the same old thing that's been happening for decades. It's not about affecting real change for animals. It's not about recognizing the sentience of animals and their capacity to suffer and feel pain. It's about, giving them slightly larger cages, that sort of thing.
Well, Chris, I ask everyone who comes on the program to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall when you first started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
I think that would have to be when I was 10 or 11 and had that epiphany that they probably didn't want to be eaten. It just seemed like a very strange dynamic, and one that I decided I no longer wanted to support.
Right, wonderful. So you might have already said a little bit about this question as well, but perhaps you've got something else to add. Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
I'd say it was the establishment of that first animal welfare organization that I set up, and it had good intentions, but it was quite misguided in the sense that it was very welfarist, you could call it. It was definitely aimed at smaller incremental improvements to their welfare and not the larger picture of questioning whether we should be doing this to animals at all.
Well, Chris, if you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Probably Sean Monson, who wrote and directed the film Earthlings back in 2005, which was in many ways the inspiration for Lucent and Dominion, because I'd show people Earthlings here in Australia and they'd say, oh, that doesn't happen here in this country, or the footage is too old. So I wanted to make an Australian and up-to-date version of that film. And in making Dominion, I got to meet and work with Sean, and that was a really great experience.
Wonderful. Well, in your view, what's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
It's a tough question. I think it's different for everyone. You really just have to figure out what your skills are and what's going to be sustainable for you. People tend to think that they see an activist who they admire and they think they have to do the exact same thing. Maybe it's someone who does public outreach and they think, how can I be as good a public outreacher as that person? But that's not for everyone. I mean, everyone has their own specific skills that they can bring to this movement. I think it's about identifying what those are, working to fill in any gaps that there are, and just focusing on how you can make your activism the best, rather than trying to be like an activist who's already out there.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. I really do feel that people need to contribute in a whole range of different ways. I don't think there's just one way of contributing. And I also like your inclusion of, something that's sustainable for you, because, of course, burnout's a very real thing in the animal protection movement.
Yes, definitely.
So, Chris, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I suppose the subjugation and exploitation of animals for human purposes. We don't need to do it. There's no valid excuse or reason to do it. We can live perfectly happily and healthily without exploiting and abusing animals. And that's the kind of world I hope to see.
Wonderful. Well, Chris, can you tell us what you're working on next?
At the moment, we're focusing on building up our organization. We've got a number of campaigns that are due to come out this year. But we're also considering the possibility of shorter format films rather than another long film like Dominion. I think it may suit us better to produce a series of shorter films that can comprehensively cover specific issues.
Wonderful. So where can people find out more about your work?
They can go to aussiefarms.org.au, or the Dominion Films website is dominionmovement.com.
Wonderful. And are you looking for people to join Aussie Farms, or how can people contribute if they wish to?
So we do have a volunteer form on our website under the Support Us tab. I'd also encourage signing up to our mailing list, because from time to time we'll send out requests for assistance on campaigns. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and just keep up to date with what we're working on, because we do, as I say, from time to time we need the help of supporters, sometimes financially, but sometimes it might be sending out an email or submitting a submission to council to prevent a new piggery being built, that kind of thing.
Right. Wonderful. Well, go to Aussie Farms, check it out, support them if you can. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about their work. And you can also find us online, Twitter at Knowing Animals, and also on Facebook. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.